Wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying a sound no man expected to hear, a desperate fading cry. Left for dead in the unforgiving snow, one woman's survival hinged on a solitary trapper who had sworn off humanity years ago. Mercy was her only hope. The winter of 1883 in the Montana Territory was not merely cold. It was a living, breathing predator. It stalked the valleys, froze the rivers solid, and swallowed men whole. High up in the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Range, isolation was the only currency that mattered. For Gideon Mercer, it was the only way to stay alive, not just physically, but in his soul. Gideon was a mountain man in the truest sense, towering, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that caught the morning frost. He looked more like the grizzly bears he tracked than a man who had once worn a tailored suit in civilized society. He had retreated to this unforgiving wilderness 5 years ago, seeking a silence loud enough to drown out the echoes of his past. On a frigid Tuesday afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A blizzard was moving in, promising to bury the timberline under feet of fresh powder. Gideon was rushing to finish checking his final trapline near Whispering Ridge when his snowshoes caught the edge of something unnatural. The snow had been disturbed drag marks, heavy and deep, leading toward a steep rocky ravine. He paused, his gloved hand resting on the stock of his Winchester rifle. Wolves, no. The tracks were clumsy, human. Against his better judgment, Gideon followed the trail to the edge of the drop-off. He peered down through the swirling flurries, his sharp eyes scanning the jagged rocks below. There, caught in a tangle of dead pine branches, was a splash of crimson and torn wool. It was a woman. Gideon scrambled down the treacherous incline, the loose shale and ice tearing at his boots. When he reached her, his breath hitched. The cruelty inflicted upon her was beyond the casual violence of the frontier. It was deliberate, systematic, and pure evil. Her face was a canvas of deep purple contusions, her lips split, and her left eye swollen completely shut. The rich fabric of her traveling dress was torn to rags, and dark crimson stained the snow beneath her shattered leg. She was completely unresponsive, her skin the terrifying, translucent shade of marble. Gideon stripped off his heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it around her fragile, broken frame. As he lifted her, her head rolled back, and a faint, rattling breath escaped her lips. She was barely clinging to the mortal world. "Hold on," Gideon murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp, unused to speech. He felt the terrifying flutter of her fading heartbeat against his chest. "I won't leave you." The trek back to his cabin was a waking nightmare. The blizzard broke, unleashing howling sheets of ice that blinded him. Every step was a battle against gravity and the crushing weight of the storm, but Gideon's massive frame pushed through the snowdrifts with a mechanical, desperate rhythm. He did not know this woman. He did not know why she had been discarded like garbage in the wilderness. But in a world that had stripped him of everything he loved, he refused to let the mountain claim another victim. Miles away in the booming, corrupt mining town of Helena, the men responsible for her condition were raising glasses of expensive bourbon. Bo Thatcher, a ruthless railroad magnate whose charm masked a sociopathic soul, stood by the roaring fireplace of the local saloon. Beside him was his chief enforcer, Levi Stanton, a man with cold, dead eyes and knuckles permanently scarred from his trade. "Is it done?" Bo asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tossed her down Devil's Drop," Levi replied, lighting a cigar. "Even if the fall didn't snap her neck, the cold will finish her by nightfall. No one survives the Bitterroots in a storm like this." Bo smiled a handsome, terrifying expression. Clara Jennings, his fiancée, had made a fatal mistake. Clara, an educated, fiercely intelligent woman from a respectable Eastern family, was supposed to be a trophy. But Clara had a conscience. She had found Beau's private ledger, a damning book that detailed his bribes to Judge Horace Montgomery, his hired assassinations of rival landowners, and the orchestrations of the Clear Creek massacre. When Beau discovered she had read the ledger, the facade dropped. The charming businessman became a monster. He beat her relentlessly, breaking her body, but not before she managed to sew the ledger into the heavy lining of her winter petticoat. Believing the book was lost somewhere in her personal belongings, Beau had ordered her disposed of. He didn't know she still had the evidence on her, and he certainly didn't know about the mountain man who had just kicked open the door to a warm cabin, carrying Clara inside, prepared to fight death itself for her life. For 4 days and 4 nights, the cabin was a battleground. Gideon Mercer barely slept. He became a shadow, moving from the hearth to the bed, tending to the broken woman with a surprising, gentle precision. He set her shattered tibia, binding it tightly with straight pine splints and torn linen. He brewed bitter willow bark tea to break her raging fever, painstakingly dripping the medicine past her cracked lips. During the worst of the fever, Clara thrashed in the heavy wool blankets, trapped in the nightmarish loop of her beating. She screamed for mercy. She cried out names that made Gideon's blood run cold. "Beau! Please!" She would whimper, her voice a fragile thread. "The ledger. Levi, don't." Gideon sat by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The name Beau echoed in the small, smoke-filled room. It was a common enough name, but paired with the brutal nature of her injuries, a dark suspicion began to take root in Gideon's mind. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever finally broke. The wind outside had settled into a low, mournful hum. Clara opened her eyes. The world was a blur of rough-hewn logs, hanging dried herbs, and the warm, flickering glow of a stone hearth. Panic seized her instantly. She tried to sit up, but a blinding agony shot through her ribs and leg, forcing a sharp cry from her throat. "Don't move!" The voice was deep, resonant, and entirely foreign. Clara's breath caught as a massive silhouette stepped out of the shadows. She shrank back against the pillows, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. Was this one of Beau's men? Had they found her? Gideon stepped into the light, raising his hands slowly to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. My name is Gideon. I found you in the ravine. You've got 3 broken ribs, a fractured leg, and a concussion. If you try to run, you won't make it to the tree line." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. His face was weathered, marked by a faded scar that ran across his left cheek. His eyes, however, were a striking, piercing grey, and they held no cruelty. Only a quiet, solemn sorrow. Where am I?" she managed to whisper, her throat raw. "Bitterroot Mountains, about 40 miles from the nearest town," Gideon replied, pulling up a wooden stool beside the bed. He handed her a tin cup of water. "Drink. Slowly." Clara took the cup with trembling hands, wincing as the movement pulled at her battered muscles. As the cool water soothed her throat, reality came crashing back. The ledger. She frantically dropped her hand to her waist, searching for the heavy lining of her petticoat. It wasn't there. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt. "Where are my clothes?" she demanded, panic flaring in her eyes again. "Frozen solid and soaked in blood," Gideon said plainly. "They're in the trunk at the foot of the bed. I didn't go through your things, if that's what you're worried about." Clara sagged in relief. The evidence was safe. She looked back at the giant of a man who had pulled her from the jaws of death. "Why did you save me?" Gideon looked at the fire for a long moment before answering. Out here you either save what you can or you become part of the rot. I've seen enough rot." He turned his grey eyes back to her. "Someone wanted you dead in a very bad way. I heard you talking in your fever. You mentioned a ledger. And a man named Beau." Clara froze. The golden rule of survival she had learned over the last week was to trust absolutely no one. "It's a private matter," she lied, looking away. "Just a robbery gone wrong." Gideon let out a low, humourless scoff. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on his knees. "A robbery doesn't shatter a woman's face and throw her down a gorge. A robbery takes your purse and leaves you on the road. This was an execution." He paused, his voice dropping an octave. "Was it Beau Thatcher?" Clara's head snapped back to him, her unswollen eye wide with terror. "How do you know that name?" Gideon stood up slowly, his towering frame seemingly sucking the air out of the small cabin. The calm, stoic mountain man vanished, replaced by something much darker. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Before I came to these mountains," Gideon said, his voice a dangerous, trembling whisper, "my last name wasn't just Mercer. I was a homesteader in a valley called Clear Creek. I had a wife, a young son. Thatcher wanted our land for his rail line. When we refused to sell, he sent his men in the dead of night." Clara gasped, covering her mouth as the pieces fell into place. She had read about the Clear Creek fire in the ledger. It wasn't an accident. Thatcher had ordered his men to bar the doors of the homesteads and burn them to the ground. "I was out hunting," Gideon continued, staring at his rough, calloused hands. "I came back to ashes. I spent 5 years up here, waiting for the coward in me to die, so I could go down there and put a bullet in his skull. But I never had proof of his crimes. The law in Helena Judge Montgomery, they're all bought and paid for by Thatcher. I was just a crazy, grieving widower." Clara reached into the heavy wool blankets, her heart aching for the broken man before her. She understood his pain, his isolation. They were two ghosts destroyed by the exact same monster. "Gideon," Clara said softly, wincing as she shifted her weight. "Bring me my dress from the trunk." He looked at her confused, but did as she asked. He pulled the ragged, stiff garment from the chest and handed it to her. With trembling, bruised fingers, Clara found the thick seam at the hem of her petticoat. She asked Gideon for his hunting knife. Carefully, she sliced the heavy thread, reaching into the lining. She pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I was his fiancée." Clara confessed, the shame and anger burning in her chest. "I thought he was a good man until I found this in his safe. It's his personal ledger. It lists every bribe, every payoff to Judge Montgomery, and every order he gave his men, including the fire at Clear Creek." Gideon stared at the little black book as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly reached out and took it, opening the pages. His eyes scanned the meticulous, arrogant handwriting of Beau Thatcher, detailing the exact prices paid for the lives of Gideon's family. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the cabin. The wind outside began to howl once more, rattling the thick wooden shutters. "He knows I read it," Clara whispered, tears finally escaping her eyes and stinging her battered cheeks. "He doesn't know I have it, but when he realizes it's missing from his safe, he won't stop. He'll send Levi Stanton and his trackers to find my body. When they don't find me in that ravine, they'll come looking." Gideon finished snapping the book shut. His eyes, once filled with profound sorrow, now burned with an icy, terrifying resolve. The mountain man who had sworn off the world of men was gone. In his place stood a man, with nothing left to lose, handed the key to his vengeance. Gideon walked over to the mantel and lifted his Winchester rifle. He checked the action. the metallic clack-clack ringing out like a judge's gavel in the quiet room. "Let them come," Gideon said, looking back at Clara with a fierce, unbreakable promise. "I told you I wouldn't leave you, and I'm going to make damn sure Beau Thatcher never hurts another soul as long as he lives." For 3 weeks, the cabin served as a fortress against both the brutal Montana winter and the dark memories that haunted its 2 occupants. Healing was a slow, agonizing process. Clara's ribs knit together with painful stiffness, and the deep purple bruises on her face faded to a pale, yellowish hue, leaving behind a jagged scar above her brow. Yet as her physical wounds mended, a profound transformation took place within her spirit. The pampered, terrorized fiancé of a corrupt railroad baron was gone, burned away by the fever and the harsh reality of the bitter roots. In her place emerged a woman of steel. Gideon watched this transformation with a quiet, reverent awe. He had spent 5 years convinced that humanity was nothing but a plague of greed and violence. Clara proved him wrong. Despite her excruciating pain, she insisted on helping. She learned to mend his heavy wool socks. She ground coffee beans with a mortar and pestle, and she listened to the few stories he offered about his past, without an ounce of pity, only profound understanding. The silence between them, once heavy with trauma, grew warm and comforting. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows across the log walls, Gideon sat oiling his Winchester. Clara was brushing out her long, dark hair, the firelight catching the chestnut strands. "You never told me your wife's name," Clara said softly, the rhythmic strokes of her brush pausing. Gideon's hands stilled on the rifle. He looked up, his grey eyes catching the flicker of the flames. "Martha. My boy's name was Samuel. He was 4. Clara absorbed the weight of those names, nodding slowly. "Beau took everything from you. But he didn't take your humanity, Gideon. If he had, I would be dead at the bottom of Devil's Drop." Gideon set the rifle aside and crossed the small room, his heavy boots making no sound on the floorboards. He knelt beside her chair, his massive, calloused hand gently reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His knuckles grazed her cheek, sending a sudden electric jolt through them both. "I thought I was dead inside," Gideon whispered, his voice trembling with an emotion he hadn't felt in half a decade. "Then I found you in the snow. You brought me back, Clara." Clara leaned into his touch, her breath hitching. In Gideon she found a safety she had never known, existed a fierce, unyielding protection rooted in genuine care, not possession. She rested her hand over his, her thumb tracing the faded scar on his wrist. "We are going to survive this," she vowed, "and we are going to make him pay." But down in the valley, the devil was already making his move. Beau Thatcher had returned to his palatial estate in Helena, only to discover his hidden wall safe slightly ajar. The ledger was gone. The realization had turned his handsome features into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Without that ledger, he was untouchable. With it in the hands of the authorities, he would hang. He immediately summoned Levi Stanton. "You told me she was dead," Beau hissed, slamming a crystal decanter onto his mahogany desk. "She went down the drop, boss," Levi replied, his dead eyes narrowing defensively. "No one could survive that." "Then her corpse has my ledger," Beau roared. "Take Rufus Wyatt and Hiram. Go back to that ravine. If you don't find her body and that book, don't bother coming back." The storm had long since passed when Levi and his men reached the edge of Devil's Drop. The snow had settled, but the high mountain winds had blown away the powder in patches, revealing the icy crust beneath. Levi peered over the edge. There was no body. Instead, clinging to the frozen shale, Rufus spotted something else, the faint, unmistakable gouge of a man's snowshoe frozen solid in a patch of ice that the wind hadn't erased. "Someone hauled her up," Levi growled, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine snow. He pulled his repeating rifle from his saddle scabbard. "We track 'em. We burn whoever it is out, and we get that book." It took them 2 days to track Gideon's faint trail through the treacherous timberline. They moved like hungry wolves, driven by the promise of Thatcher's gold and the thrill of the hunt. Back at the cabin, Gideon was outside chopping firewood when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was a primal instinct, honed by years of surviving grizzly territory. The forest had gone dead silent. The jays weren't calling. The wind had died down. He dropped the axe, his eyes sweeping the dense tree line. A sudden unnatural flash of light caught his eye, the reflection of the midday sun off a brass rifle scope 100 yards out. They had found them. Gideon sprinted for the cabin door, kicking it shut behind him and throwing the heavy iron bolt into place. Clara jumped, dropping the tin plates she was washing. "What is it?" she asked, her heart leaping into her throat. "Company," Gideon said grimly. He moved to the windows, slamming the heavy wooden shutters closed and barring them, leaving only small gun slits open. He walked over to the table and slammed down a heavy Colt revolver, sliding a box of cartridges beside it. "Levi?" Clara asked, her hands beginning to tremble as the memory of his scarred knuckles flashed in her mind. "Most likely," Gideon said, grabbing his Winchester and stuffing handfuls of ammunition into his coat pockets. He looked her dead in the eye, grabbing her shoulders to steady her. "Listen to me, Clara. You do not hesitate. If anyone but me comes through that door, you pull this trigger until it clicks empty. Do you understand?" Clara looked at the heavy gun, then at Gideon. The fear in her chest solidified into something cold and hard. She picked up the revolver. "I understand." The first shot shattered the tense silence, tearing through the wooden shingles of the cabin roof. Levi Stanton wasn't a man for negotiations. He wanted to flush them out with fear. "We know you're in there," Levi's voice echoed through the trees, warped and menacing. "Send out the girl and the book and we might let you walk away, mountain man." Gideon didn't answer. He slipped the barrel of his Winchester through the gap in the front shutter. He spotted movement behind a massive Douglas fir. Wyatt, one of Levi's hired guns, was attempting to flank the cabin on the left. Gideon exhaled, steadied his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. Wyatt crumpled into the snow, a blossom of crimson staining his chest. "Return fire!" Levi screamed. A hail of lead rained down on the cabin. Bullets tore through the thick timber, sending deadly splinters flying across the room. Clara ducked behind the heavy cast-iron stove, covering her ears as the deafening roar of gunfire filled the small space. Gideon moved with terrifying efficiency, shifting from window to window, returning fire only when he had a guaranteed shot. "Hiram, get the dynamite!" Levi shouted from behind a rocky outcropping. "Blow the door!" Gideon cursed under his breath. "They're trying to breach. Stay down." Hiram, a bulky man with a thick beard, broke from the tree line, a lit stick of dynamite in his hand. He was fast closing the distance to the porch. Gideon tracked him, but his rifle jammed a frozen casing caught in the chamber. "Damn it!" Gideon grunted frantically, clawing at the breech. Hiram reached the porch and drew his arm back to throw the explosive. Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed from inside the cabin. Hiram staggered backward, dropping the dynamite in the snow as a hole appeared in his shoulder. Gideon looked back in shock. Clara was standing near the window, the heavy Colt smoking in her trembling yet resolute hands. She had fired through the gun slit. The dynamite detonated in the snow just off the porch, sending a concussive shockwave that blew the front door off its iron hinges. The cabin filled with blinding white smoke and the smell of sulphur. Through the haze, Rufus charged the open doorway, a shotgun raised. Gideon, abandoning his jammed rifle, drew his hunting knife and lunged. He tackled Rufus to the floorboards, the shotgun blasting a hole through the ceiling harmlessly. Gideon's immense strength ended the struggle in seconds, driving the hilt of his knife downward. Before Gideon could rise, a heavy boot kicked him squarely in the jaw. He fell back, his vision swimming. Levi Stanton stepped over the threshold, his revolver leveled at Gideon's chest. The enforcer was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, his eyes wide with adrenaline and malice. "You put up a hell of a fight for a dead man," Levi sneered, cocking the hammer of his gun. "Levi, wait." Levi turned his head slightly. Clara stepped out from behind the smoke-shrouded stove. She was holding the black leather ledger in her left hand, holding it out over the roaring flames of the open hearth. In her right hand, the Colt was aimed squarely at Levi's head. "You shoot him and I drop the book in the fire," Clara said, her voice eerily calm, betraying none of the terror she felt. "Thatcher will skin you alive if you come back without it." Levi hesitated. His greed fought his bloodlust. "You wouldn't burn it. That's your only leverage, girlie. I am a dead woman anyway, aren't I?" Clara stepped an inch closer to the flames, the leather binding beginning to smoke. "Lower the gun, Levi." Levi's eyes darted from the book to Clara's resolute face. He slowly lowered his revolver, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "Smart girl. Toss it here." "Catch," Clara said. She didn't toss the book. Instead, she threw a heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the stove's edge directly at Levi's face. It was a distraction, wild and desperate. Levi ducked, raising his arm, his gun firing blindly into the floor. That split second was all Gideon needed. With a feral roar, the mountain man surged upward, grabbing Levi by the throat and slamming him against the log wall with such force the entire cabin shook. Levi dropped his gun, gasping for air, as Gideon's massive hands crushed his windpipe. "This is for Clear Creek!" Gideon hissed, his grey eyes dark as a winter storm. With a final sickening crunch, he threw Levi's lifeless body to the floor. Silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and their ragged breathing. Gideon stood, chest-heaving, his fists covered in blood. He turned slowly to Clara. She dropped the heavy revolver, her knees finally giving out. Gideon caught her before she hit the floor, pulling her tightly against his chest. "It's over," he whispered into her hair, burying his face in the warmth of her neck. "It's over." 3 weeks later, the booming town of Missoula, far from Judge Montgomery's jurisdiction, was abuzz with scandal. A federal marshal presented with Beau Thatcher's meticulously kept ledger had ridden into Helena with a dozen deputies. Thatcher was dragged from his mansion in irons, screaming threats that fell on deaf ears. The evidence of murder, arson, and extortion was irrefutable. The monster was finally caged. As the news reached the newspapers, Gideon and Clara stood on the porch of a newly built cabin, far away in the quiet serenity of the Flathead Valley. The Bitterroot nightmare was behind them. Gideon wrapped a heavy woven blanket around Clara's shoulders as they watched the sun set over the pristine snow-capped peaks. He pulled her close, kissing the faint scar above her eye, a mark of her incredible survival. She leaned into his embrace, sliding her hand into his. They had both been broken by the cruelty of the world, but together they had forged something unbreakable. Mercy had saved her life, but love had saved his soul. What an incredible journey of survival, revenge and unexpected love. Gideon and Clara proved that even the darkest winters can't extinguish the human spirit. If you loved this Wild West tale and were cheering for Clara's bravery at the end, please smash that like button. It helps the channel grow. Share this story with fellow romance and drama lovers, and make sure to subscribe for more thrilling original stories every week. Stay safe out there.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, I Won't Leave You, brutally beaten, she was saved by a mountain man's mercy, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the power of compassion during someone's darkest moment. This story highlights how kindness, courage, and simple human decency can make a difference when a person feels vulnerable and alone. It's a reminder that choosing to help someone in need can leave a lasting impact. Do you think the mountain man's greatest strength was his courage or his compassion? And what part of the story affected you the most? I always enjoy reading the different perspectives viewers bring to these conversations. One lesson we can take from this story is to pay attention to people who may be struggling and offer support when we're able. Even small acts of kindness can mean more than we realize. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, consider liking the video and subscribing to Rugged Heart Man.